As some comrades say, it's lit, right? lit. Real, glad, lit. Right? The revolution is lit.
Ahuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study, live with the leader of the African nation, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Today's study goes in depth on the world's first successful workers' revolution, the African Revolution of Haiti. We have this discussion today during the US colonial holidays of Juneteenth and Father's Day. In the Uhuru movement, we've historically referenced Juneteenth, which is supposed to represent the day Africans were freed from formal chattel slavery in the US as not yet Uhuru. Because when we look out at the conditions of Africans in the US and throughout the world, whether we're in places like Haiti, in London, or in occupied Azania, African people still do not have power, do not have control over our land or labor. We are still violently dominated by the same colonizer population that put us here. So Juneteenth doesn't represent true freedom of African people. It was no African revolution that took place on Juneteenth. But we do take advantage of this day to unite and organize African people towards genuine freedom, to deepening the consciousness of our people around these questions. We can say similar things about Father's Day, which is supposed to be a day that recognizes and appreciates fathers. And of course, we can, say Africans, call on Africans to recognize the contributions of their fathers in their daily lives, to their daily lives. But we also recognize that fatherhood for African men looks differently than that of the colonizer. In fact, colonialism makes slaves of African men by forcing them into these concentration camps called prisons, by politically and economically starving African families, severing the relationships that our people are able to have with our communities. This being the case, our task when attempting to show just how much we appreciate our African fathers is to fight for their freedom. It is to organize them into African revolution, which will free them and their families. There is no item on the shelves of department stores more valuable, more meaningful and sincere than the gift of revolutionary struggle and freedom. And this brings us back to why we have to talk about the world's first successful workers' revolution. And to do a better job at this, I will be introducing the African Socialist International Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa, who will provide us with our overview. Following, we will hear from Chairman Omali Yeshitela on this question and open up for questions and discussion from the live audience. As always, before we begin, take this moment to like and share this video and tag someone to participate in today's lesson. Comment hashtag shared in the chat section for us when you've done it. Turning it over now to ASI Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa. Uhuru SG. There you go.
Hello, Director Akile. I struggle a bit to get the video to start. I click on it many times. So thank you so much, Director Akile. I appreciate this opportunity once again to be in this panel. And today it is, as you heard from Director Akile, very important study we're going to do today. And I want to invite everyone, just to unite with the demand from Director Akile. Share. You know, if you shared last time 5 times, you go double it. If you did 10 times last time, you go double it. That'll be 20 times. So we need to reach all corners. So this is, as I say, this is an important study. This is African internationalism. So when you hear me reading, going through this PowerPoint presentation, you are watching and listening to African internationalism, African Revolution of Haiti. As you heard Dr. Akile say, the first successful workers' revolution, the number one that changed the world. That's what we need to follow on what they did some 200 years ago. Next. First, we want to salute our leader, the leader of African Revolution, the leader of African nation, in fact, the leader of the worldwide revolution. So salute Chairman Yeshitela and his theory of African internationalism, which is a profound response that is changing the world, that's waking up Africans everywhere and also bringing new light everywhere you are to understand the world today, but most importantly, how to change the world. Next. Haiti is an example of what Chairman Yeshitela calls the colonial mode of production. Really, the first time for you, you need to write it down. Colonial mode of production. We want everybody to understand this. Africans producing a life, not for ourselves, but for our oppressors, the colonizers. Everything they have comes from this colonial mode of production. Every thinking, every education, every entertainment, every factory, everything you see where you are, be in the United States or France or Germany or wherever you are, is a direct product of this colonial mode of production. Next. The Taino people lived on an island they called Haiti, a land of mountains, for thousands of years. They had their own way of living. They produced for themselves. They were happy, and most importantly, they had control over their destiny. The destiny was in their hands. They have what we call self-determination. Remember, there is no price for self-determination. There is nothing more valuable than for any people to have the right to determine their own destiny. So they had it. Next. Columbus landed on Haiti in 1492 and immediately began genocide and looting, taking resources back to Europe. And that's really important to understand that this happened 77 years after the Europeans attacked Africa. So there's direct connection between the attack on Africa in 1415 and the attack on Americas in 1492. Next. The Tainos welcomed Columbus and helped him survive. And that's really important. wherever the Europeans went, in America, in Africa, in Asia, they were welcome, just like, any human being. You want some food, they give them food. Place to stay, basically, they did not, they were not attacked, basically, when they landed. People were curious to see who they were. But as soon as they were able to set foot there, the agenda was quite clear, is to attack, to assault, and the slaughtering people, and the rest, as we know it, colonialism was in action. Next. Columbus wrote, we can send from here, in the name of the Holy Trinity, all the slaves in Brazil wood which could be sold. Remember, in history books in schools, we were told he was an explorer. What kind of explorer is going to any place that's not even their land to steal, precious wood, to transform human beings to slavery, to slaves, and things like that? And Holy Trinity, this is a way of telling you the church, the Catholic Church, was a part of an assault on the people of Americas and the rest of the people of the world, the non-white people of the world. Next. Columbus' men raped, tortured, slaughtered the Taino people. This is just a manifestation of colonialism. When you hear raped and tortured and slaughtered of the oppressed people, you're looking at colonialism, and they're doing it because to steal the land, the resources, to get them to do things against their will, violence has to be used. That's why you see all these violence, raped and tortured and etc. To steal the land, you must commit violence, otherwise you can't steal the land. Next. Dogs were trained to attack the indigenous people and rip out their intestines. Just, many times we heard dogs are the best friends of human beings and something like that. They train dogs not to be friends of indigenous people, but to attack them, to weaponize the dogs against other human beings, and that's colonialism. And today you see the police in France, in UK, in Germany, whenever they go to colonize people, you see them with dogs trained to intimidate you, to attack colonized people. Next. Genocide. Within 40 years, the entire Taino population was killed. Just imagine, within 40 years, the so-called explorers going around the world because they were curious to understand the world, they exterminated the population of Haiti within 40 years. Can you just imagine if somebody came to Europe, or some people came to Europe, and within 40 years, the people of Europe were exterminated? That's how serious it was. Within 40 years. That's genocide. Next. Columbus named Haiti Hispaniola, Little Spain. You can see, remember these history books again? They went around the world looking for spices. Now they're stealing the land. There is no land called spice. Land is land. So it's really profound. Colonialism, is definitely, as you can see, can't be done without the theft of the land of the Africans, indigenous, and other colonized people around the world. That's really significant because people still struggling sometimes. Can explain colonialism is, you can see, is the white people stealing other people's land. That's part of colonialism. Next. In 1697, Spain ceded the western third of the island to France. And this is here the Spanish behaving as if the land was theirs. They gave the land to France, which is not their land in the first place. And France grew cotton, indigo, tobacco, sugar, cocoa on a huge plantation in Haiti with enslaved African people. You go remember colonialism, you can see what it does. It produces things that will be consumed by Europeans. So Europeans consuming things that didn't produce. You're looking at colonialism. Every time you go to the supermarket where you are, you see things not produced by white people, not from Europe, and so on. you're looking at colonialism. Next. In the 700s, the French grew tobacco and sugar on the island. Saint-Domingue, that's how Haiti was named by the colonizers. Remember, the indigenous didn't call it Saint-Domingue. That's the colonizers calling it Saint-Domingue. Was called the Pearl of the Antilles, creating most wealth of all French colonies. And that's really, really fundamental for us to understand. Particularly, France is known for the French Revolution. You need to know Haiti funded the French Revolution. Most of the resources that changed France came from Haiti. A third of the wealth going to France was coming from Haiti. Next. France achieved colonial wealth by kidnapping and enslaving African people, working them to death within 7 years. You're looking at the foundation of the French Revolution once again here, because they call themselves, enlightenment people, something like that. But that's how it came to being, basically, within 7 years, which means it could be within 6 months, 3 months, a year. Africans worked to death to produce, the development of France and the rest of Europe. Next. By the late 700s, more than 50,000 Africans per year were forced to Haiti. You go remember these kidnapping, stealing, terrorizing African in their own homeland, and wounding and killing, because it's kidnapping. It means a lot of people died, and those who make it, let's say 50,000. Can you imagine how many Africans did not make it? Under brutal conditions of torture, colonial violence, and this was a daily life of Africans, and it's still a condition of Africans everywhere. Colonial violence, without which there is no colonialism. Africans need to know that. Next. During this time, African resistance grew strong, and it's important to note, to really stress this: we always resisted. From the shores of Africa to the slave ship to the shores of Americas and to those slave plantations, up to this very moment, Africans always resisted. Next. Maroons, escaped African resistance fighters who created their own self-government, because they understood very well, nothing's more important than freedom. Nothing's more important than freedom. And that has to be our way of life. Do everything until we retrieve our freedom, our self-determination, our right to self-determination. Next. Maroon leader Macandal led an uprising of African people in 1758. Now that's really important, because you're going to see from here to the Haitian Revolution in 1804, it was relentless until we won in 1804. Next. African people launched the first battle of the Haitian Revolution in 1791. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. This is just 2 years just after the French Revolution that we Africans in France influenced the French Revolution by making demands while being in France. And of course, the French Revolution, when it happened, Africans heard about it. And the possibility that the oppressors, being the feudal, the aristocracy, can be overthrown, that was also significant. Africans start dreaming, how to make it reality where we were in Haiti. Next. In 1798, formerly enslaved Toussaint Louverture led an African army that defeated the British invasion. You go bear in mind here that from 1791, in August 1791 until 1804, African resistance, African fighting to be free was relentless. It was relentless. You're talking of roughly 13 years, non-stop, relentless. I think it's really important to stress that, because we're putting dates on the screen. You think it's like one event process. No, you had at least 10 years ongoing African fighting to get back our right to be a self-determining people. Next. Toussaint Louverture then ruled Haiti, but it did not declare independence from France. That's really important, because he really trusts the French. He wants a recognition from France, and he wanted to basically to continue to rule Haiti, but in agreement with France, which basically want to reform colonialism as it was known in Haiti. Next. In 1802, Napoleon sent 30,000 of his best troops to try to reclaim Haiti. Because you go remember, the French Revolution outlawed or banned slavery. And as soon as, Napoleon came to power, one of the things they wanted to do is to reintroduce slavery. And that's why basically Napoleon sent his troops in Haiti. Next. The French lured Toussaint onto a ship, kidnapped him to France. Toussaint Louverture was told by his lieutenants, and one of them was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, he shouldn't go to that ship, he shouldn't trust the French. But he didn't listen, because remember, Toussaint always wanted recognition by the French authorities. Toussaint died of pneumonia in brutal freezing conditions in northeast France, in French mountain prison, separated from Africans in Haiti and from his family too. Because when he was kidnapped, he was also kidnapped with his family, but he was separated when he reached France. Next, please. Napoleon ordered slavery reinstated in Haiti. That's what I say. That's exactly what Napoleon, because France, as a colonizer nation, could not survive, couldn't continue without control of African colonies, without continuity of slavery. That's how central slavery as an aspect of colonialism was known then. Next. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Louverture's chief lieutenant, then led the Africans against the French. Next. African women made up nearly 45% of the Liberation Army of Haiti. And that is really significant, because that victory in Haiti could not happen without the participation of African women as fighters, as women in the front, armed with weapons, and going on the offensive and killing the colonizers. Next. Dessalines believed in total independence for Africans in Haiti. He did not seek, that's really important, recognition by the colonizers. He did not want to reform colonialism, colonial slavery in Haiti. It was clear that Haiti has to be totally liberated, regardless of what the French ruling class thinks or wants to do. Next. Under Dessalines, Africans waged brilliant guerrilla warfare against the French, and Haiti became Napoleon's Vietnam. And that's really significant, because Dessalines basically anticipated, I can say, Ho Chi Minh and the brilliant general Van Giap in Vietnam, fighting against a powerful army in the world. At the time, Napoleon's army was the best in Europe, the most powerful in Europe, and the Africans went against that army and won. Next. 26,000 French troops were killed by the African revolutionaries. That's really, really, really important. That's why I say they, anticipated, or they announced basically, the Vietnamese successful revolutionary struggle, because you have to kill the colonizers. That's the only way you can get your freedom. And that's what the Africans in Haiti did. And we're talking about 26,000 French troops. Napoleon sent basically, I think 25,000 troops. That's what he sent from France. Of course, some were already in the island and also in other islands like Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint Martin, and the others. And he sent 86 ships. You've got war ships. 86. That's a lot. Next. Napoleon then sent in his brutal general Rochambeau, and before they sent Rochambeau there was another general, say General Leclerc, which is the brother-in-law basically of Napoleon, and he was defeated, and Napoleon sent another general, Rochambeau, and Rochambeau had a reputation of being cruel, and colonizers are always cruel. But this guy had a reputation of being cruel by the standards of the colonized themselves. So Rochambeau wrote to Napoleon that to reclaim Haiti, France must re-enslave African people and destroy at least 30,000 African men and women. He burned alive, hanged, drowned, and tortured African prisoners, burying African people in piles of insects and boiling them in cauldrons of molasses. Next. Dessalines ordered each act of French terror to be repaid in kind. Just like Malcolm X, tooth for tooth, eye for eye. So after one battle, Rochambeau buried 5 Africans alive. Dessalines responded by hanging 500 French prisoners. And that, you got to remember, this is just early 19th century. We're talking of 1802 or 03. Dessalines was able to do that. Next. Dessalines and the Africans defeated the French army on November 18, 1803. And that was an earthquake. A white army, the best of the white power colonial army, defeated by the African slaves. That was an earth shaking of such magnitude that, today, it takes time for Africans to really realize what it meant then. Next, please. Haiti declared independence on January the 1st. He didn't wait. He didn't seek permission. He didn't wait recognition. He said, we've got the power. We're in control. From today is an independence of Haiti. Next, please. The African Revolution of Haiti was a blow to the world economy centered on the sale and forced labor of African people. Just have an idea what Russians, oil, gas, and fertilizers and wheat is doing to the world economy. Now imagine Haiti played even a more significant role then, because most of the wealth was coming to France, was coming from Haiti. And also the news went around the world, particularly the United States and Brazil, all the colonizing nations, that the slaves now are able to organize until the colonizers be free. Can you imagine what it meant for the colonizers, that the Africans are coming and they're armed, organized, determined? Next, please. Our victory in Haiti was a blow to the colonial mode of production. Massive blow. Remember, we're talking about colonial mode of production. It means the center, all the economic revolved around the colonial mode of production. No colonial mode of production, no development, no economy, no world economy at all. No Americas anyway, at all. So we have really to bear this in mind. Next. Principle of independent Haiti constitutions. Anyone escaping oppression anywhere in the world will be accepted in Haiti. All citizens, even Europeans, will be known as black. Freedom of religion. No white person could own land in Haiti. That's revolutionary principles, in these constitutions. Next, please. The Haiti Revolution inspired fierce resistance inside the US, including Denmark, Vinci, Nat Turner. Every African saying, we are on up, we are coming, we are on your offensive. We are, it's a turning point in the world. Next. From 1824, 1826, independent Haiti accepted 6,000 Africans escaping U.S. enslavement. Can you just imagine? If you can just put your foot in Haiti, you're free. From anywhere in the U.S. or Brazil, anywhere Africans were colonized, anywhere they can be free to be once they put their feet in Haiti. Next. The African Revolution of Haiti inspires Simon Bolivar and revolution throughout South America and the Caribbean. That's changing the world. That's basically what Haiti, has done. Changing the world as it was known then. Next. In 1825, Haiti was forced by U.S., Britain, and France to pay France $560 million in gold francs for stolen property. The property was African people themselves and land stolen by genocide. They used the world upside down. Instead of paying the colonized, the slaves, it's the opposite. The slaves have to pay the colonizers. That's just robbery of high, just there are no words to describe such felony, such theft. There are no words for that. Next page. African people in Haiti were forced to pay France and then the US for 127 years. Remember, we made them rich. We built the world economy. We built more than France, more than US, more than Britain, and so on. And after that, we had to continue to feed them, for 127 years after the Haitian Revolution. Next page. This was a loss of $150 billion to the economy of Haiti, and I believe this is the conservative estimate. France and the US are fattened at the expense of the forced impoverishment of the Africans of Haiti. Next. To pay its debt, Haiti was forced to take out a loan from French bank. That's basically, we have to borrow our own money they stole from us. Haiti is now the poorest country in the world, and France is one of the richest. The relationship is clear. Reparation is due. This is the colonial mode of production. African people produce life and wealth for the colonizers. Remember, it's no racism, it's colonialism. Next. France sold the entire Louisiana territory to the US for only $15 million. You go remember, this is a direct consequence of the victory of the Africans in Haiti that basically forced France to sell Louisiana to the United States. More than 800,000 square miles west of the Mississippi. Next. Haiti loan was given by a French bank that made millions in interest. The bank, Credit Industrial and Commercial, financed the Eiffel Tower. So remember Eiffel Tower? We built it. We financed it. Next. The US occupied Haiti very brutally from 1915 to 1934 in the face of an ongoing people's resistance. The US was financed by Citigroup Bank and looted Haiti treasury, occupied with Marines, killed the people's leaders, set up neocolonialism, rewrote Haiti's constitution, ending the prohibition of white land ownership. As colonialism. Reparation is due to. Next. The US maintained overt control of Haiti's treasury until 1947. US and France government and people enriched at the expense of African people in Haiti. There is no explanation. Reparation is due. Next. This is why Haiti is the most impoverished in the Western Hemisphere. Look where we live. All our wealth needs to come back. Next page. US set up and backed the murderous neocolonial leader, Francois Papadoc Duvalier, seen here with Nelson Rockefeller. That's a response, basically, that started with the assassination of Toussaint Louverture, basically, to impose neocolonial leadership over Haiti. Next. Duvalier established the paramilitary death squads known as the Tonton Macoutes, hated by the people. That's what the colonial army and police are. They're the death squad. Next. With Tonton Macoute and Duvalier, the US waged a bitter reign of terror and counterinsurgency against all resistance fighters in Haiti to prevent, the process of completing the Black Revolution there. Next. When Papa Doc died, he was succeeded by his son Jean-Claude Baby Doc. Next. By the ongoing African resistance in Haiti, which ousted Baby Doc and the brutal Duvalier regime in 1986. Relentless resistance in Haiti. Relentless. Next. In 1990, popular leader Jean-Bertrand Aristide won 67% of the votes for president. Next. Aristide base was in African working class. Like Toussaint Louverture, Aristide believes in the legitimacy of the colonizers. Remember that? He believed in the legitimacy of the colonizers. Next. Aristide was overthrown by a US-backed coup in 1991 for demanding reparation from France. Like Toussaint, Aristide was kidnapped by the colonizers for demanding the restitution. France to return the 150 million in 150 million franc in gold, basically, that they imposed Haiti to pay them. Next. Again, fierce resistance of the people rose up. Remember, we say Haiti is the place of relentless resistance. Next. After 2010 earthquake, Clinton Foundation stole millions donated to Haiti. You can see, the colonizers, they can't live without stealing. That's really a part of being a colonizer. You have to steal from black people, from colonized people. Next. And Clinton paid no price. And remember, Obama appointed Clinton responsible after the crisis, after the earthquake in Haiti. Obama put him in charge there. Next. Haiti is only one example of the colonial mode of production. The majority of the world has been colonized by Europeans. Next. U.S. wealth and capitalism built on stolen African labor in Haiti and the Americas. Next. African Socialist International. Next. Only African liberation led by the organized African working class can destroy the colonial mode of production. That's really fundamental. You've seen throughout what we have to say about colonialist mode of production. But in order this system to be overthrown, to be eradicated from the planet, the Black Revolution has to eradicate the colonial mode of production. And we are the only social force. Short of eradication of colonial mode of production, we will never know peace and freedom and dignity and power and happiness. And that's why building the African Socialist International, building the African People's Society Party, wherever you are, is significant. So I think this must be the last slide. So I just want to thank the Director of Agitation Propaganda, Akile, for this opportunity to this program. And back to everyone. In the meantime, continue to share. Meet your goals, comrade.
Uhuru Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa, thank you so much for just that profound overview, this look at the incredible revolution that was the African Revolution in Haiti, which has really important implications for the struggle that we're involved in today. And as we can see, as you showed, that the resistance, the fervor of African Revolution has never left Haiti. And I think that's just something that we have to, all be mindful of. And we're talking about waging an international African revolution. And Haiti served as this important example to the overall struggle that has to occur around the globe, that African people everywhere we are have to participate as a part of that specific front of the African Revolution to destroy, as you stated, the colonial mode of production, the whole entire global economic system that exists at the expense of African people and all colonized peoples throughout the world. That's what the task at hand is for us. So if you're just joining us, you're tuned into the Omali Taught Me Sunday study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela and Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa. As Luwezi just gave us an outstanding overview of the African Revolution of Haiti and what it meant for the world. To deepen this discussion, we now bring up the leader of the African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman, welcome to our program.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Comrade Sister Director Akile. I'd like to express appreciation to Comrade Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa for that overview. And also, if you would help me, perhaps in the comment section, you can give me some signals about the kind of time that I have available for this discussion. But there's so many things that we need to learn from this whole movement in Haiti. Last month, the New York Times ran a really interesting series of articles on the history of rape of Haiti, stemming from France's looting of Haiti, immediately coming from this attack on Haiti, where for the first time in history, the enslaved, the people who have made a movement, a struggle to win their liberation, ends up having to pay the oppressor, to have to pay reparations for those who are responsible for the oppression. It's an interesting series of articles. It has a lot of important information. And the New York Times thought it so significant that they not only printed it in English, but also in French and in Haitian Creole, as is characterized. So they wanted everybody to have access to that and to be able to interpret what happened in Haiti from the viewpoint of the sector of the ruling class that's connected to the New York Times and that feels it necessary to get in front of this growing recognition of the existence of a mode of production that's got Africa and African people connected to it in a death grip. And that is the basis for the wealth that you will find existing in the colonizers' world. In France, in the United States in particular, this was something that was pointed out. And so I think that's really important. And it was really interesting because the article, while even as it pointed out the brutality and the theft of resources that came from the bank that ultimately created what was called the Bank of Haiti, which actually was owned by a French-based bank that developed an incredible base of resources as a consequence of the platform that it used of looting Haiti. So even as it talked about that, which is something that is hard to get around, to ignore, to overlook, it also from time to time threw in that some people disagreed with how it was being put forth in terms of the expropriation of value coming from to France from Haiti, the expropriation of value stolen from Haiti by the United States, et cetera, and making sure that it's understood by everybody who's reading this in French, English, and Creole, that a part of the problem, that they give at least equal status, equal significance, is the corruption of the Haitian, who were characterized as the Haitian leaders and the elite that existed in that country. So this is something that can only work if people are not conscious of the totality of the contradiction. And it was mentioned early on by the overview offered by Comrade Secretary General Luwezi at Kinshasa, when he talked about the fact that there is a Haiti today. There came into existence Haiti subsequent to the genocide that was perpetrated against the indigenous people there as a consequence of what? An attack on Africa. There would be no modern Haiti, and I use the term modern loosely. I mean, in this era, subsequent to the attack on the indigenous people, there would be no Haiti if there had not been the attack on Africa. There would be no Haitian Revolution if there had not been this war that was waged against Africa. And I think it's really important to understand that for a number of reasons, because that's the kind of thing that will inform our analysis of what it is that we're confronted with and how we have to deal with it. And that's the thing that undermines the extraordinary logic that you hear coming from CIA or some other kind of US-based or Western-based intelligence position narrative that somehow Africans who were born in the United States through the process of slavery, the only ones who were due reparations because somehow other Africans did not participate in the creation of the value that was born solely, they would say, of Africans who were enslaved in the United States. And what we see, of course, is that's an absolute lie. It's untrue that an attack on Africa is the thing that resulted in us being in what they call Haiti, and that the economy, the modern economy of the world, this is what that article that I'm telling you about, or the series of articles in the New York Times demonstrates very clearly that the economy of the world that we are talking about is one that came as a consequence of an attack on Africa and the enslavement of African people virtually everywhere, including on that island that has come to be known as Haiti as a consequence of the African revolution, African-based revolution. So I think that's something that we should really be conscious of. Another thing that is really important for us to understand is that it was not enough to defeat the French on the battlefield. We defeated France. We crushed France in this effort. Someone used the term that Haiti was France's Vietnam. The truth of the matter is that the lessons of Vietnam were certainly something that could have been gained from a recognition of what happened in this place that we know as Haiti today, Haiti. And it was an incredible movement that happened there. And the fact is, again, that it is something that was born out of the existence of a particular kind of social system that did not exist before. And it's also worth noting that in this tiny island that was producing a tremendous amount of the world's sugar, certainly for the Americas and this hemisphere, but also for Europe, and coffee, this tiny island that we are looking at created so much value. But it was something that happened in the process, first of all, of Africans who were located on that island having to fight not just France, but this island fought what? It fought England. It fought in struggles against the Spanish and also against France. So we're looking at the major colonial powers in the world that occupied this island, and Africans had to fight all of them. And it's worth noting that Africans had to fight all of them. And because what we're looking at is the basis of a world economy that came into existence as a consequence of the colonial enslavement of African people and the emergence of a world economy that did not exist before this happened. And this did not start on the island Hispaniola. It started and with the attack on Africa, with Portugal playing such a fundamental role in this process, enriching itself as a part of the struggle against Africa to locate where the gold and resources that they had heard about some years ago as a consequence of Mansa Musa's travel from Mali in West Africa all the way on his way to Mecca. And the gold, the 60,000 strong entourage that carried with him. And this was like 1328, 3,000 miles on horses and camels with gold all the way. And at a time subsequent to that, something like 1347, this plague that hits Europe, destroys the economy of Europe. And then Europe, there was no Europe as such. These were just the places that might have been referred to as Christendom. At the time, groups of warring tribes who identified themselves primarily not as French, not as Italians that didn't even exist at that time, not as Germany that didn't exist that time, but as these warring tribes constantly at war and identifying and defining themselves in relationship to each other. And it's the process of colonial slavery going out and capturing African people, looking for resources to deal with an economy that has been wiped out just about by the plague, where that denied the existence of any successful economic development. This is the process that they had to conquer. This is the thing that set so-called Henry, the so-called navigator, in motion. This is the thing that led to what they would characterize as this age of discovery, looking for the gold that was known to have existed in Africa and traveling all over initially around around Africa and ending up capturing African people, enslaving African people. And this is the process that led to so many Africans being shipped to this place that we now know as Haiti. But at the same time, we see the struggle in Haiti. We talk about the emergence of the economy, development of the economy of France as a consequence of that. France was also stealing resources. It would end up stealing resources from what is called Senegal and other places that became territorial extensions of French power. This is the thing that helped to develop and create what came to be Europe, what came to be France. It was born of this process. The world economy that people talk about and say that they hate in many instances, the capitalist economy, could be no capitalism if there had not been for this attack on Africa. Certainly the capitalism that we read about, that we think about, I know that there was some political theory that suggested that it would have been a natural outcome of developments in Europe, but it was not a natural outcome of development in Europe. The thing that developed in Europe was poverty and despair and disease. And what happened was Europe stepped outside of that experience, the totality of that experience, and then attacked Africa and initiated a process of colonialism, colonization, and enslavement all around the world that gave rise to a whole new world economy and a whole new identity for this group of people who initially were just disparate entities fighting with each other over resources. Now they have achieved a collective identity, a collective economy. This is the world that we are talking about, that we're looking at when we look at Haiti. We're also looking at the fact that as successful as Africans were on the battlefield in Haiti, we saw that the economy that grew out of the trade in African people, out of colonial slavery, the colonial economy now has locked the entire world. There's no longer a so-called French economy, and there's no longer certainly that stands in isolation and separate from the economic activity of most of what now becomes the white world. In fact, the white world becomes a part of a colonizer entity. It is now comprised of colonizers that locks France, England, Spain, and Italy, and these, as it comes into existence later on, and these various other entities into a single kind of consciousness. There is a new global society that has been created now. This is what we talk about when we talk about a mode of production. It is a society where all of the activity is activity that contributes to an ability to feed itself, to clothe itself, to house itself, that's based on this extraordinary contradiction, this extraordinary relationship between one group, a small group of colonizers stealing resources and enslaving people, a larger group of people, a parasitic relationship. This is the origin of the world economy that grew what people refer to as capitalism today. This is the basis of the existence of capitalism. Without Haiti, there was no capitalism. In fact, that's one of the reasons that Haiti was such an extraordinary threat to the existing social order. When we talk about how France demanded reparations from Haiti, this was not just a question of France doing that. It required the cooperation of all of the colonial powers in the world, including the United States. They all cooperated, collaborated And this whole notion that somehow it was the corruption of African leaders in Haiti that's the basis of the misery there. It is a mode of production that came into existence and required the cooperation of all of the other beneficiaries of this mode of production, the whole colonial power, all of these colonial forces that attacked Haiti, that Africans in Haiti had to fight against, as you see them engaged even today in this war against Russia, that they claim to be something that's been beneficial, just as they were claiming that the attack on Haiti was beneficial to humanity as well. I think it's really important for us to understand this is what we're looking at. When we do this, then we place ourselves appropriately, especially African people, at this place in terms of understanding the emergence of existing social system and the ability to destroy it. We come closer to understand the centrality of Africa and African people. And it's really important. Also, a lesson that we should really learn is that the rapidity with which they were murdering and killing enslaved African people in Haiti required an ongoing resupply of Africans from Africa to this place, this small island. And this is part of the basis for the ongoing resistance that you see happening there, because these were people who were not there long enough to learn how to be happy slaves. This was Africans who were born in Africa. You found so many of them right there in Haiti. And it was just in this place called Haiti. And so the resistance was very strong. People had a memory of freedom on this island that perhaps did not exist in some other places where Africans have been for a long period of time. And you've had generations who were born into a colonial enslaved kind of environment and situation. So it was a powerful revolutionary movement and that emerged from this. And what we saw happen in Haiti, precisely because so many Africans were brought there, is a concentration of the resistance. So before, we had Africans who were located on the continent of Africa, but didn't necessarily have a common consciousness in terms of a consolidated national consciousness that would come about as we saw beginning to occur in Haiti. And this gives us an example of the potential for revolution. Because in Haiti, these Africans who came from various other places on the continent of Africa, they consolidated a revolutionary spirit, a revolutionary consciousness that was opposed to being oppressed and exploited, and they waged that struggle. And I think it's also important to say right off the bat that African people and the people of the world cannot achieve freedom within the colonial mode of production. That there's no votes that's going to solve this. They voted the end of slavery in France. And then after they voted the end of slavery in France, Napoleon comes to power, and then he liquidates the significance of that vote and say, let's get them again. We find ourselves being victims of a colonial system, a social system, which means that the colonial state is the dominant force that connects all of our oppression, that extends its arms of brutality, military forces, intelligence organizations, and things like that across the globe, and also into our situation as Africans. For example, there's a mention in that series of articles in the New York Times that I mentioned earlier, that was also referenced in the overview that Comrade Secretary General Luwezi did about how the United States government intervened in Haiti, and how at a particular time when the U.S. government took forces to a resignation that they forced Aristide to sign, who was president of Haiti at the time. They forced him to sign this, put him on an airplane, and then on that airplane took him from Haiti to Central African Republic, which was a French neo-colony, a French colony. And this is really interesting to note, because some people may remember at this time, the US and France were having a split fracas among themselves, because the French did not unite with the United States in terms of how it was conducting the struggle against Iraq, not because the French were sympathetic to Iraqis, but because the French saw their own interests, economic interests, being challenged and undermined by United States activity in Iraq. And because of that, you saw this great outpouring of rage that emerged inside the United States, led by the elites inside the United States, that made it them talk about how they were not going to sell French fries anymore. They're going to be freedom fries, and all of that's ridiculous because that definition of freedom, even in this instance, required the potato that was introduced to their diets by the indigenous people, and perhaps even including Taina, who they killed. This is where the potato comes from. And so now you can't call it French fries, they're freedom fries. So you have this contradiction between France and the United States. But that contradiction was not one that will allow for any assault on the colonial mode of production. So they can argue and bicker among themselves, but one thing is certain: they are not going to allow for this Haiti, this struggle of African people fighting for their freedom in Haiti, to disrupt the colonial mode of production, which holds the whole thing together. And so the French and the United States conspired so that the United States was able to put Aristide on the airplane, take him to the Central African Republic, which was the French colony. Despite the fact that they were bickering around Iraq, the fact is that what they saw as the most fundamental to maintaining the colonial mode of production was the control of Africa, Africans, and all of the other peoples who would be influenced by the struggle of it happened in Haiti. And Haiti continued for a long time. It continues to be something that is an example that's intolerable of a Black people, Africans, the colonized, fighting for and winning our own freedom and being able to establish our own government. But the problem is that even if Haiti had been successful, we still been locked into a colonial mode of production. That is to say, look at what happened with this colonial mode of production is something that has to be consciously fought against, organized around. And the philosophy that I've developed in terms of the colonial mode of production, or the introduction of this whole question of the colonial mode of production, is the thing that's absolutely necessary for us to overturn this relationship that we have with the colonizer. Look at Vietnam, one of the most courageous struggles you ever want to see in the world. Vietnam makes this struggle with the assumption that's common to many Marxists, that somehow the premier mode of production was what they characterize as capitalism, and somehow the Africans and other colonized people are sort of auxiliary forces that give significance to the mode of production that they characterize as capitalism. So the assumption was that in Vietnam, in China, and even in Russia, that victory could come and people could go ahead and initiate a socialist or communist kind of society, but it doesn't work that way. Because even with the victory in Vietnam, the colonial mode of production continued to exist. And the colonial mode of production is what hooked the entire world economy together. And the fact is, the historical basis for the rise of socialism it requires the destruction of this pedestal upon which the colonial pedestal upon which all of the activities of the capitalist economy rest. And this is, look at Vietnam. Look at what is happening today. The Afghans in Afghanistan, the Afghans defeated the United States on the ground, fought them for more than 25 years and crushed them, and had them leaving in such a hurry that they had to leave a whole bunch of sellouts and things like that to fend for themselves after their defeat. But they still control the world economy. And the fact is, the colonial mode of production continues to prevail. And the Afghans are starving. They are starving the Afghans today, just like they starved African people in Haiti. After we won that, they forced African people at gunpoint, and they forced African people through starvation. They continue to do that today, so that the victory just on the battlefield is not enough. The colonial mode of production must be overturned. That's the only way that Venezuela would ever know any peace and freedom. So I want to say those things, and I also want to say that we have to see the struggle that we talk about in Haiti as being vanguard. But another thing is that there were all kinds of currents, cross currents that existed during the Haitian Revolution. There was the issue of a sector of the population, the so-called little colonizers, the little white people who were fighting in their interests and saw African people's emergence as an independent force, something that was contrary to their interests. They needed to see colonialism still in place in Haiti, but they were opposed to how the big time colonizers were dominating Haitian economy, but they did not want to see African people achieve a leading, dominating role and controlling that. So you had that. You had the so-called mulattoes. You had these educated African people, that is to say, educated by the French primarily, who were contesting in this whole process. So even with the success of the Haitian Revolution, I mean, and I have so much appreciation for Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was crucial to actually achieving the closest thing that we could have independence in Haiti, who understood that we could not allow the whites to come back, who is the one who constructed responsible for the Constitution that's saying no foreigners, no whites could own land in Haiti. You had this force. Then you had the United States government, the United States itself, who became active part of the attack on Haiti, which is really important. This is something that has to be said, to all those people who somehow think that African people who exist in one place or the other place, that somehow we fight this thing on our own and don't recognize ourselves, the fact that we're dealing with the world economy, and this world economy is based on a colonial mode of production that's locked most of the peoples of the world into the subservient relationship as hosts to a European parasite that defines everything culturally, legally, the systems of law that has come into existence on the basis of this. This is what it is that we looking at. And so I think it's important for us to understand the total picture, and for there to be actual freedom. The total overthrow of the colonial mode of production is necessary. There is not going to be any freedom short of that. We will always exist in this oppressive and exploitative relationship until we destroy that. Let me say that this should not be the most complicated thing in the world. And the only thing that complicates it is the fact that most of our vision, most of how we perceive the world has come about as a consequence of the colonial mode of production. And the colonial mode of production is a mode of production that is dominated by the parasitic colonizers. And the colonizers, which is the minority of people on the planet Earth, dominates the real world and dominates the narrative that defines who we are and who they are. And the more we come to under their influence, the greater the likelihood that we accept this definition of our reality. And it's a false definition. It's a false definition in the sense that it has no basis in material fact. It has its basis is political in the sense that it maintains the ongoing oppression of our people. It makes an assumption of the inferiority of African people. This is the explanation that the Europeans gave themselves to justify what it was that they were doing. How does an impoverished, starving Europe end up dominating the world? How does that happen? It happens because Europe now, as Rudyard Kipling, one of England's most significant poets and historians would say, that the Europeans have taken up the white man's burden. And the white man's burden, according to them, was to bring civilization to the rest of us, etc. It explains itself as the great heroes who rescuing the world and rescuing the savages from our own brutality. This is something you hear every day, even now. from most of the oppressors. This is the explanation given for what Europe and Europeans and Americans are doing around the world in terms of world domination. So this colonial mode of production has to be something that we are consciously engaged in overturning. We are a party, a revolutionary party that understands that there's no way you can compromise between total and absolute liberation of Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class. You can't compromise that goal with some kind of promise or some kind of moderation of the colonial system itself. It has to be overturned. That's what we are about. That's the thing that informs everything that we do. That's why we say when we look at the state, look at what you saw just in an overview around Haiti and the brutality that was imposed there. You see in microcosm, you see a concentration of the colonial brutality, the colonial state at work. Haiti is good to look at because you can see in Haiti, you see what's happening in the United States. You see what's happening throughout Africa and throughout various other places in the world where the colonizer has come. Well, because brutality, extreme violence, vicious violence is absolutely necessary for maintenance of this social system. And not only is it necessary, there's a philosophical assumption that's always tied to this. And this philosophical assumption, as quiet as it kept, is one that shows that the European, the white man, the colonizer, is the civilizer, is the one who's bringing peace and harmony, and sometimes has to do it against our own will. And I remember this thing that happened in Vietnam, how this famous line that was made come from a US general that talked about how they had to destroy the whole village in Vietnam in order to save it. And that's exactly what you see colonialism doing. The majority of the peoples of the world live as hosts to a colonial mode of production. Majority of the people on the world in Haiti being an extreme example because it's something that has to be, because the philosophical, the ideological foundation of the colonial mode of production is what they characterize as racism. And this notion in Haiti of Black people in charge of our own affairs, that's a weighty kind of thing that gives inspirations and ideas to other Black people and oppressed peoples around the world that we don't have to live under the domination of the white man. We can destroy colonialism. We can be free as a people. We can have our own freedom, etc. And this is something that is difficult for toleration. So by this social system, it's a threat to the social system. And this is part of what makes the struggle in Haiti so significant and something that we have to learn from. So when you look at Haiti, recognize that French were there, the British were there, England was there, the Spain was there. Then you look at Portugal's role in creating this colonial mode of production. You see it was in short order that what at one time might have been a policy of Portugal or a policy of Spain or a policy of one of the European powers to go out and enrich themselves, in short order, you saw the emergence of a colonial economy that united all of them. This is how Europe got created. There was no such thing as Europe. The emergence of this colonial economy laid the foundation, the economic basis for the concept, for the sense of sameness that would unite people who were Celts and Normans and the others, would unite them into a single a sense of nationality, if you will, a sense of sameness. This was the foundation for it all. And I think it's really important for us to understand that. And it's important for us to understand that there is no way for us to win our freedom as in these individual pockets that have been created for us by white power, by the colonizer. There is not going to be a successful Haitian revolution. The Haitian revolution has to be self-consciously a part of the Haitian front of the African Revolution. The same thing is true in West Africa. The same thing is true in the United States and in England and throughout Europe. We have to become part of the fronts of the African Revolution. That's the only way we can attack the total colonial mode of production. And we do this in relationship and lining up with other colonized peoples around the world who suffer from the same oppressive social system. That's what it is that we have to do. And I think it's really important to say this. that we do a lot of work as coalitions within the African People's Socialist Party, or coalition work. But we understand that it's not going to be a coalition that liberates us. What's going to liberate us is the fact that the African working class, for the first time in history, has its own revolutionary organization that's conscious of its own interests, conscious of its own aims. It's an advanced detachment of the overall African nation. That's why we talk about a colonial mode of production. That's why we talk about the need to organize for absolute and total liberation of all African people. That's why it's necessary for us to organize globally, because in order to win, in order to have the kind of society that we want, as opposed to trying to find a place within the colonial mode of production, the colonial mode of production has to be destroyed. And central to that is the liberation, unification of Africa and African people globally. That is the mission of the African People's Socialist Party. That should be your mission. That's why you should become a part of the African People's Socialist Party, so that we can recapture our freedom. And it's hard for people to imagine African people, what freedom looks like, because for so long that this oppressive system has weighed down on our backs, has broken our backs in so many instances. But there is an advanced attachment, there is a vanguard, there is a way to understand this reality, and the African People's Socialist Party is trying to provide the direction for that. So I'm still, put something in the chat for me. So I just think it's really important for us to understand that we are talking about an attack on Africa when we look at the Haitian Revolution, and that it is worth mentioning that central to the revolutionary project that many people claim to be interested in is Africa and the African Revolution. I look at Haiti as an example, where the world's first successful slave rebellion happened, where the world's first workers' revolution ever occurred on the planet Earth. And this should be the template, this should be the example, this should be the inspiration of any other revolutionary organization that claims that its objective is to bring the working class to power, that its objective is to end colonial slavery. But it's not. And all of the people who we look to for some kind of leadership, the intellectuals, I'm struck by how in Germany in particular, the emergence of what was characterized as the Spartacus League. And the Spartacus League, of course, is something, it was a communist organization that took its name, Spartacus, from someone who fought against Roman slavery more than 2,000 years ago. They fought heroically, but they lost. But they didn't lose in Haiti. And yet we don't see a Dessalines League or even a Louverture League coming out of this situation, because the Germans who created the Spartacus League as a response to exploitation and oppression could themselves had the benefit of the colonial resources that gave birth to what came to be known as Germany and what came to be known as most of the European powers. They could not see, they could only see us as some kind of auxiliary forces whose history was significant only to the extent that it contributed to the development of Europe. That's where Marx comes up with his primitive accumulation of capital. The primitive accumulation of capital is something that talks about the startup of capitalism, how capitalism got started, of turning Africa into a war for the commercial hunting of black skins, it says. But our significance is not as a part of a revolutionary movement to win our freedom. Our freedom is a part of implications, it has significant implications for what it does to the development of Europe. Is the primitive accumulation of capital that it sees as something that represents modernity and development over what existed before. And it is modernity over what existed in Europe before: pestilence, disease, poverty, feudalism, etc. But it's not progress for what existed in Africa before. It's not progress for what existed in what we characterize as the Americas before, where whole peoples were wiped out as a part of this, what he characterized the accumulation of the primitive accumulation of capital. The struggle against colonialism has been the crucial struggle. Let me say this, that today people are watching what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. They're trying to. They're not able to see that because the same forces who created this world economy, who historically have the basis in enslaving Africans in Haiti and on the continent of Africa and in the Americas, destroying and killing the indigenous people here, stealing half of Mexico. Those same forces are the ones that are explaining what is real about the so-called Russia-Ukrainian question. These are the colonizers. These are the same forces who were given birth to. They came into existence as a consequence of colonial slavery. That's where they came from. And they have been fighting to maintain that status quo ever since. And I'm just reminded how people want to look and see, well, how did this thing happen? And people can look at Russia and see that in something like 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, they can see how the Soviet Union came to be wiped out. They can see how in 2014, the coup that was made in Ukraine that put this motley crew in power now, that has this historical relationship to Nazis. And I use this term fascism and Nazis loosely because the fact is that for us, it doesn't, the issue is not whether a colonizer is a democratic colonizer or a fascist colonizer. Colonialism is colonialism, and it kills and maims us naturally before the crisis inside the system gives rise to some phenomenon that they refer to as fascism. That is a special designation that's given to contradictions that white people live on the pedestal of our oppression have to encounter. This is a special designation. But colonialism, you saw some photos in the overview that was given about the terror waged against colonized people. You know that there are people who don't even exist anymore as a consequence of the rise of this whole colonial mode of production, world economy, etc. It's important to recognize that. So you look at how people measure what is progressive and what is the thing that's going to lead the revolutionary struggle. And they are able to see some of those things in terms of Russia and Ukraine. And some of them are so arrogant, they say, well, you know, both of them are bad, Russia and Ukraine, and Putin is a dictator or something to that effect. Now, I don't know who Putin is. You probably know more about Putin than I do. But what I do know is that the attack on Russia did not start now. And that the Russian Revolution that happened in 1917 was one of a myriad of struggles being made by oppressed peoples in the world. And what distinguished Russia in part was because it saw itself as part of a European process of making revolution, but we were looking at revolutionary struggles that was happening in places like Nicaragua against colonialism. We were looking at revolutionary struggles that were happening in place in the Middle East. We were looking at the attack that in 1915, just 2 years before the Russian Revolution, the Marines had attacked Haiti and looted all of the gold and resources out of there. All around the world, colonized people were fighting. They're fighting in Mexico, fighting in Nicaragua and various other places around the world. And the Russian Revolution was something that happened in that context. That's the thing that made it spectacular, was that it succeeded as compared to what Garvey did. Garvey's movement took off in 1917 in a big way, just as the Russian Revolution occurred. Garvey sent letters of congratulations to both Trotsky and Lenin during this entire process. And Garvey led the most significant anti-imperialist, anti-colonial revolutionary movement in the world at that time. But nobody recognizes Garvey because we did not win. We did not succeed there. And Russia, a tiny party in Russia, I say tiny, despite the massive terrain that Russia occupies in the world, but Russia succeeded. And in 1918, something like the year immediately following the Russian Revolution, Russia was invaded. And you know who invaded Russia? All the powers who were in Haiti. All of the colonial powers, including the United States and Japan, which was a colonial power as well. They all attacked Russia. And what they had done was they had kept Russia out of the world economy that benefited and grew from colonial expropriation of value from the Caribbean, from Africa, and all those other places. And what it meant was that the Russian Revolution was something that brought Russia into modernity, a communist revolution, a socialist revolution, if you will. It wasn't through colonialism that Russia achieved modernity. It was through the fight against a social system that they characterized as capitalism, which had its foundation on the colonial looting of the peoples of the world. That is the thing that brought Russia into modernity. And that is the thing that made it necessary for them to fight Russia, fight Russia, fight Russia all this time, because Russia was also finding alignment with all of the colonized peoples around the world. The majority of the peoples around the world who were not Russians, but the colonized peoples around the world who are still fighting against the same social system. And it's important for us to understand that. So people look at what Lenin had to say. People look at the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, etc., because it was successful in that regards, but it was not peculiar in the fact that it was fighting against the social system, except it called itself fighting against capitalism, while the vast majority of us were fighting against colonialism, which is the foundation upon which capitalism rests. And that put the Russian Revolution in alignment with what it is that we were doing, colonized around the world with Garvey, with Pancho Villa, with Zapata, and all these other forces who were engaged in struggles against the colonial mode of production. And so that's the critical thing to understand, which means that by the time the Russian, the Bolshevik regime, the Soviet Republic collapsed, that Russia and the U.S. was doing dances on the grave, Clinton in particular, dancing on the grave of the dead Soviet Union, and white people were writing about the end of history now, because with the death of the struggle of the oppressed people, the death of the struggle of the working people, it proved finally that the most perfect system you can have is what they refer to as liberal democracy, which is born out of slavery and colonialism. This is what they were doing. And of course, they thought they had it made. They were able to intrude. They created an organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that united all of the colonial powers into a single body to crush and to contain Russia. They created these institutions in the 1940s, the United Nations being one of them, to make sure that the colonial powers could control the world now without having to fight among themselves in order to do it. And they created a whole new system of trade relationships and things like that, that normalized this collective control of the world that they see now being collapsing before their very eyes. This is the problem for them. And so Russia now, after US succeeded in taking itself and NATO up to close to the Russian border, Putin comes into power and begins to push back. And the Russian people began to understand what it was that the United States was doing as a consequence of Putin's intervention subsequent to the undermining of the Soviet Republic. So this is how you see this contest now. And that meant that Russia was able, and Putin was able to challenge the total hegemony of the other colonial powers, and was able to enter into the colonial mode of production on its own terms, as opposed to being absolutely subservient to the United States. Same thing happened with China. China came into modernity now as a neo-colonial power that achieved some kind of stature that they call independence, but it's through a revolution, where a communist organization made a revolution. And so China has also entered into the colonial mode of production, or certainly standing on the border on its own terms. That means it's not controlled by what they define as this, how they characterize the rule of law, of the colonial law that came about in the 1940s. And so Russia China on their own mission, and they are having to go through the United States and the colonial mode of production that has been ruled over, that has been defined and determined in all of its goals and aspirations by the United States and all the other colonizers. That's what we're looking at. That's why we have to make a total revolution. There's no way out of this thing. There's no way out of it. Everything that we do, all of the forces that we see in motion now will require organization, and it's our responsibility to bring people onto the revolution and stop lying to the people, and don't allow them to think that there's some way they're going to be able to have a better colonialism or nicer colonialism or something to that effect. Every contradiction we see in the world has its basis in the colonial mode of production, and the only way out of it is the destruction of colonialism as a mode of production. And that's the responsibility of our party. And that's why you should join the African People's Socialist Party right now. Join the African People's Socialist Party, become a part of this great mission. And of course, that's not easy in terms of what has to be done, because there's a certain discipline that's absolutely required. There's a certain unity, with philosophical unity, that's absolutely required to make this happen. And it's work that's required to make this happen. So join the African People's Socialist Party, destroy the colonial mode of production, become a part of a process in terms of our party that has been relentless and fighting for 50 years, more than 50 years, to destroy the colonial mode of production for the total, absolute, unconditional liberation and unification of Africa and African people throughout the world. Uhuru. Thank you, comrades.
Uhuru, Uhuru, Chairman. That was Chairman Omali Yeshitela. That's the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution. Just want to thank you so much for deepening the significance of the African Revolution of Haiti and for laying out the implication it has on the present day. And I just want to salute you also for defining our struggle against the colonial mode of production, because this is such profound clarity that lets us see what's needed to be done in order for the African Revolution to permanently destroy this system, making way for a new mode of production. And in just a moment, we're going to take questions from you, our live viewers. But I do want to take a pause to just take a look at some of our announcements through within our movement. So let's go ahead and get those up. We do have announcements. There we go. All right. So for our first announcement, this is really exciting coming up this coming Saturday. Join the Burning Spear Publications team. Volunteer your time and skills with the book publishing division of Burning Spear Media, which is the apparatus bringing you the study this morning. Help produce and promote African internationalist books, pamphlets, posters, and more. Transcribe, proofread, design, graphics, layout, and work on promotions for projects, including the republishing of a new edition of the book, Reparations Now, the report from the World Tribunal on the first World Tribunal on Reparations to African People. Register for our open volunteer meeting scheduled for next Saturday, 5 p.m. Eastern on Zoom. Go to tinyurl.com/2022 publications. From July 3rd to the 16th, Black Power 96 Radio is holding its July member fund drive, celebrating 5 years on the air. This is your chance to support radio in the hands of the African community. Donate to become a supporting member or renew your support. Tune in at 96.3 FM in St. Petersburg, Florida, or streaming online at blackpower96.org and on the Black Power 96 mobile app for Apple or Android. And listen for special programming and special thank yous when you donate. Which radio station can you count on to bring you critical information about African people and explaining what's happening in our communities? Black Power 96, not just explaining the world, but changing it. For more information, visit blackpower96.org. Black Power 96 also airs your favorite Sunday study show, Omali Taught Me. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, and support the Omali Taught Me show by donating at paypal.me/Omali Taught Me. Uhuru Tours and Speakers Bureau is an institution of the African People's Socialist Party that coordinates events and tours for Chairman Omali Yeshitela and other party speakers and leaders. And you can book Chairman Omali and other Uhuru movement speakers for your campus or organization now. Email info@uhurutours.com or call 727-914-3622. 621. And to check out all of our other movement events, go to theburningspear.com/events. There's our events calendar, and you can see everything that's going on in the Uhuru movement, how to get involved, how to join. Theburningspear.com/events. So that will conclude our announcements. And the chairman just spoke about the need to join the African People's Socialist Party, join the African Revolution, take up this responsibility, and just want to direct everybody who's interested in that call to go to apspuhuru.org, fill out our contact form. But this is the time, take up the mantle, carry out the legacy of the African Revolution in Haiti by completing the African Revolution and destroying the colonial mode of production. So we're going to go ahead and bring back up our panelists. We have ASI Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa with us, as well as Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And we're going to be answering some of your questions that have come in. And before we get into your questions, want to acknowledge where people are viewing from. We have Wichita, Kansas with us, San Diego, California, Cincinnati, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Jacksonville, Florida, Huntsville, Alabama, Oklahoma City, Grenada, West Indies, Occupy Tanzania or South Africa, Jamaica, Queens, New York, Jamaica, Portland, Oregon, Miami, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago, Illinois, St. Petersburg, Florida, K2 Orphanage in Haiti, and Brooklyn, New York tuned in with us. So welcome, comrades. Thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon. And we're going to go ahead and get into questions. So Huru, to Chairman and Secretary General. So this first question, and Chairman, you've been speaking about it extensively throughout this whole study, but it erupted in lots of discussion within the comments section. So we wanted to pose it because we see this as something we have to continue to deepen. So Comrade Mwezi took the struggles happening in the comment section and formed a question based out in San Diego, California. She asked the HRU chairman, we have some viewers on this study who are convinced that colonialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And furthermore, that what is being discussed in today's study opposes what Kwame Nkrumah and Walter Rodney were fighting against. You already said it clearly that colonial mode of production gave birth to capitalism, but perhaps you can deepen how even Nkrumah, Rodney, and countless other African martyrs of that time were fighting colonialism, neocolonialism, and would have come to the same conclusions. And ideological imperialism has always been at work. So Uhuru Chairman and SG Luwezi, please feel free to jump in on any part of the discussion as well. Uhuru.
Yeah, I think Comrade Secretary General, you want to take a shot at it first, Comrade Secretary General?
Yes, sir, Chairman. This goes straight to the difference that Chairman leadership represents. You remember we said all along, fundamental questions left unresolved by the struggles of Africans in the 60s. And one of those questions basically is concentration basically of points. One is what social force should lead. The other question is what is the worldview of the African working class? Basically, what is your philosophy? How are you going to examine the world? How are you going to investigate that? What tool are you going to use? And depending on the tool you use, you will come to conclusions that will not be necessarily consistent with your long-term views. And so explain the world up to the creation or development of African internationalism. Africans, particularly the African intellectuals, or even what we refer to as the black Marxists, they always start from the point of view of Karl Marx and also arrive of the conclusion of Karl Marx. So, and also they also took the conclusion of Lenin and make it their own. They did not have an independent investigation of the world, and this is what the chairman did: investigate the world from the point of view of the African working class. Just as Malcolm X says, it's not the person watching you being sitting on a stove and you being on the stove, you don't experience the same phenomenon. One is watching you, but you are sitting on it, you burning, you catching your hair. It's not the same thing. It doesn't matter how sympathetic or the person who's watching you may say, but it's not the same. So it's clear that for us, for African internationalists, that Europe could not have come out of feudalism without leaving Europe and going around the world, robbing and pillaging and bringing resources, transforming Europe in the process, and creating basically what we refer to as capitalism. And this process of going around the world, pillaging and looting and stealing and destroying everything and stealing and accumulating wealth in Europe, that's colonialism. That's wealth that is not produced by Europe, but wealth stolen outside that creates life in Europe. In fact, transform Europe to the point that Europe used to be feudal, a society split between the landlord and the serfs. They became redundant social forces because the wealth stolen around the world created new social forces, the bourgeoisie and the working class. So the white bourgeoisie and the white working class, those two social forces were not created by capitalism, but they were created by colonialism. So capitalism, which means the society split between the bourgeoisie and the working class, are a direct result, product of an assault in Africa. Assault in America is genocide of Africans, genocide of indigenous people, theft of Chinese resources, opium war, all these manifestation of primitive accumulation. So there is no confusion whatsoever when you understand and unite with African internationalism. What came first? Colonialism came first. Colonialism came first, and you can see that every day. What's happening in the world today? The question of resources, the oil and the gas, the coltan. Could you have what we have today with the computers, with green cars? Can you have all these things without stealing from Africa in terms of cobalt and copper or nickel or coltan? These are not produced by white workers. They don't produce copper. They don't produce coltan. They don't produce our labor. They don't produce the resources generated by so-called France-Afrique, the looting of 14 African countries by France that generate at least $500 billion a year. And those resources don't stay in Africa, and etc., etc. So it's really clear, because this has practical implication. If you believe capitalism came first or colonialism came first, because you cannot answer the question, what is the social force that has to lead the process to destroy capitalism as people understand it? But we are correct in saying colonial capitalism. You will not understand what social force. You will always believe the white working class will do it, because you believe capitalism is basically an excess, or the export of excess of wealth from Europe. You know, Europeans didn't take excess wealth to Australia. They didn't take excess wealth to America or to China, did they? They didn't. They went to America and stole it and built from there. And, you know, but they didn't take excessive wealth. Europe has so much wealth. They go to America and they spread it. They didn't do that. So the question is clear to us. Colonialism is fundamental. That's the starting point. That is the mode of production. Chairman is 1,000 times correct. So that's our struggle, basically, to win that ideological battle. As I said, it has practical implication. So I appreciate that.
And one of the practical implications is the fact that we recognize that that the class struggle in the real world is concentrated in the colonial question. That's why you always see Europeans on the wrong side of this question. It's always necessary to convince Europeans, including the European communist organizations, and sometimes instances where communists have power. We've seen that in France as it relates to, like some cities that have been governed by members of the Communist Party who actually razed and destroyed the homes of African people and immigrants that they characterize as immigrants and things like that. And so what we say that the class struggle is concentrated in the colonial question. That's where it's located. And that many times what people are referring to when they look at Europe and the United States as class struggle is purely a competition, a contention between different colonizers, sectors of the colonial population over who's going to get the resources coming from the colonies, from colonialism. This is what the fight is about. Anytime you see them, if colonial question is not the central question, the only thing they can be fighting for fighting around is who's going to achieve the benefits of colonialism, whether it's going to be what they characterize as the working class, which is something that's debatable in terms of its existence in Europe, or whether it's going to be what they characterize as the ruling class. That's what that struggle they characterize as class struggle. None of them is talking about overturning the colonial mode of production, which is the foundation for the entire thing. So, and when you look at Haiti, it has to be infuriating to African people to see the starvation that exists in Haiti. I mean, one time they used to write stories about Africans in Haiti eating mud pies. Here's Africans who fed France for I don't know how long. But that's not peculiar to Africans in Haiti. Look at Africans in North St. Louis in the United States. Look at Africans in throughout the continent of Africa. It is normal. And this is a part of the whole, what do you call it? This whole structure, superstructure of colonialism. It explains the world in a fashion that normalizes the oppression, the extraordinary brutality and oppression that's imposed on African people by white people. By Europe, they normalize that, or even they find a way to disguise that and characterize that as self-inflicted by the colonized. So I just think that's really important for us to understand. So it's true, like what they see in Haiti, it's normal. We expect this. This Haiti, that's how it's supposed to be. I mean, they had, there was a time when they talked about sex of Haiti that was equal to Paris. And in fact, in some instances, people live better there, white people, the colonizers, than they did in Paris. So what happened all of a sudden? Well, the line that will be offered is that you're better off under colonialism because when Black people take power, this is what happens. But it's the colonial mode of production. It must be destroyed. And this is critically significant, especially most of our intellectuals who get their understanding of the world, get it from the colonizers. We go to institutions where the colonizers teach us to see the world through their own lenses, through their own view. And what African internationalism does, it allows African and the colonized people to recapture our own brains and to be able to see our own interests as separate from the interests of the oppressor, and makes it possible for us to separate, us ourselves politically and economically.
Thank you so much.
Chairman, Dr. Killer, just on what the chairman said, the concentration of the class questions, concentration on colonial question. That's important because that's why rightly the chairman struggled for years. The struggle is not against racism, it's colonialism. This is another aspect of the same question. And that's why the same forces, I suspect, will not be able to support Russia. They condemn Russia as well as Ukraine, as well as the United States, and they are probably opposed to reparations, people like that. So they all have practical, aspect of it. Yeah.
And just want to say, comment, Director, that the fact is that we were discussing this issue of reparations last week, I think it was. And, one of the comrades Aronde was right on when he talked, certainly from the perspective of how we view reparations. He said, revolution makes it possible for us to pay ourselves. So we're not relying on any of these governments or anything like that. We make a revolution, we pay ourselves. That's where reparations ultimately is going to come from. And Uhuru, Director.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman and Secretary General Luwezi. And as we wind down the time here, we have some really incredible questions. I'm going to take this one from Comrade Janelle in Jamaica. And she asked her chairman, can you elaborate on why there will not be any other quote unquote solo revolutions in other islands/colonies, but various fronts of the African Revolution?
Well, the thing is, what is the objective of the revolution? The error that we make is that we think that we can win some revolutionary freedom within the structure of the colonial mode of production. That somehow it's possible look at, and I use Vietnam as an example, you will never find a more heroic revolutionary movement than what you saw in Vietnam. But Vietnam is still under the colonial mode of production. It's still having to trade under the rules set by the United States and the French and all these other powers who they had to fight for so many years. So the point is that there is no solution that is independent of the assault on the colonial mode of production that dominates the entire world. And so when we look at Africa and we say that Africa is central to the whole revolutionary movement, just as it was central to the emergence of the colonial capitalist social system itself, then we recognize that just as they didn't just control us in Haiti from France, we are part of a whole world economy that they established that gave all of them a stake in maintaining the slavery of African people in Haiti. And we've been dominated by this whole world economy at different times under more or less a greater leadership by one sector or another of the colonial capitalist ruling class, but always within the colonial mode of production. We're going to have to win our freedom in that fashion, and we're going to have a revolutionary movement that unites the African revolution all over the world, so that we have a single movement, the type of which Marcus Garvey, actually strive to bring into fruition in the best possible way. Uhuru. I hope that responded effectively, Comrade Janelle.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you. And thank you, Comrade Janelle. And I would just also to that, say that the practical, work of our party is the existence of the African Socialist International to achieve this. And, and we're also joined here by the ASI Secretary General. So, for it all come full circle. I'll go ahead and take one more question. Like I said, we have some really brilliant questions in here. This last one is going to come from Comrade Matsamela in San Diego, California, who asked, Uhuru Chairman, I love the example of the potato you brought up. Can you say more about how that represents the colonial mode of production? Also, I would say that they have taken our resources and allowed it to define themselves. Can you say how us taking back our resources is connected to the identity crisis that colonizers are experiencing now? And he says, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. The last part of that, the problem that the colonizer has is that the colonizer has fabricated a reality of who we are in order to justify who the colonizer is. It's a fabrication. It has nothing to do with the reality of the world. And so and the fabrication presupposes that our enslavement, our oppression and brutality is normal. That's the thing, that's the way it happens. That's the way that we are responsible for it in so many ways. And that is, they used to in the United States, used to talk about how Africans who were enslaved were just really happy. We love being enslaved and things like that. And this was a creation of their own brains. This is what they created about our reality. So to the extent that we began to break out of that and to win and fight and win our freedom, then it makes it impossible for the colonizers to accept his own definition. It's a problem. And not only because is it a problem, because the colonizers has based his own definition on how he has defined us. So when we are no longer what they said, like for example, if we continue to say as we do, and more people are conscious of it, if I am an African living in the United States, who is the white guy? Who the hell are you? If I am an African, you have to define me as something else. And I'm telling you, that's not who I'm an African. So you have based your identity on who you say I am. So you're in trouble. And that affects the morale, the consciousness. And part of what we were saying earlier is that victory is it's an ideological perspective. It contributes to an ideological worldview as well. There's an assumption that the old flag never touches the ground, that the white man always wins and things like that. And to the extent that you see masses of people breaking out of that, you see Twin Towers coming down, you see people in Iraq, you see people in Afghanistan, you see Africans in Africa and inside the United States and other people breaking from that, then there is a serious problem. And we are doing that. And you have people now claiming you will not replace us. Who the hell is the colonizer talking about? You will not replace us. Like somehow African people and the oppressed represent some kind of thing to exterminate them. They are the exterminators. But now they're in this position of putting forth this ideology, this idea, you will not replace us. That's why the Munich Security Council, 2020, what they are talking about. They're talking about the era of westlessness, the disappearance of the power of the white man, of the colonizer, et cetera. This becomes a part of their own consciousness. And that's part of what it is that we are looking at in the loss of confidence. We're seeing an escalation, an uptick in the death of white people of a certain age, certainly in the United States, of suicides, alcoholism, all this stuff, because of the notion of who the white man is something that certainly has proved not to be something that is true, or something that can. What was the other part of that question that Massimiliano raised?
Let's go.
What was the first part of that?
It was regarding how you used the question of the potato and how that represented.
Oh yeah, and of course the potato. I mean, you know, they take it from the indigenous people, and that tobacco and all this other stuff that they use, and it becomes a part of their identity and what have you. So it can be a French fry when the French never did a damn thing with the potato except steal it. And so, you know, that's a part of the colonial mode of production that we are talking about, that all of the economic activity within this colonial mode of production has its basis in expropriation of value from the colonized. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, and SG Luwezi. So that is going to wrap up our Q&A portions, but I just want to thank all of you who submitted those questions. I got the discussion jumping, and this has just been another fantastic study, and we have to follow Haiti's example everywhere we are throughout the world. So at this point, we are at the end, and I just want to turn it over to Secretary General Luwezi for closing remarks, followed by the chairman, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it all up. So, Uhuru, SG.
Yes, well, thank you, Director Akili, as the Director of ICPOP and Propaganda. I want to thank your whole department, and I want to thank our chairman, Omali Yeshitela, brilliant leader of the African Revolution, whose contribution is, I can't really say, you know, it's not yet fully understood by most people in the world, because he's been significant in shaping the worldview of anyone who wants to see, who wants to understand what's going on, but most importantly, as he always says himself, change the world. So I just want to thank you for that. I want to say just a couple of things. Talking about Haiti, we already said we are carrying out the legacy of Marcus Garvey. And I think now we also can claim that we are carrying out the legacy of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. By that I mean they achieved the first successful slave rebellion, and the African Socialist International is going to lead basically the first international workers and socialist revolution in the world. And that's basically when we say our mission is to complete the Black Revolution in the 60s, unite Africa and the leadership of African working class. That's what we're talking about, achieving the first international worker socialist revolution, the first international Black Power international revolution. And these responding also to the question they ask regarding colonialism. Our struggle is different because we are kicking off, because it's a process we are involved in, the international, worldwide, basically, revolution that will not only end the United States led white power domination, also will deliver what people are demanding, a multipolar world, but most importantly, a world without colonialism. And that's is going to be a direct result of a successful African working class revolution. And I just want to say that Dessalines used to have a slogan. He used to say, leave no whites behind. We say, leave no white power behind, and don't leave no opportunities behind. And these are the struggle the African People's Party is waging. So once again, I just want to say thank you to everyone who listened, And we want you to join, not just share, but also to join. And I appreciate being on this program as usual. So, or
Uhuru. Thank you, Comrade Secretary General, and thank you, Director Akile. I want to say also that what we need to understand in terms of how we learn from the revolutionary movement in Haiti. Dessalines was an extraordinary figure, and that there was never a moment during the Haitian Revolution and subsequent to the Haitian Revolution where the French and other forces were not involved. Dessalines was assassinated. There's no doubt in my mind that he was assassinated because his position on complete actual removal of all edifice and remnants of colonialism that made Haiti susceptible to the kind of economic intrusion and threats of war that contributed to the economic and then political decline of Haiti. There's never been a time where subsequent to that, even during that revolution, where there wasn't intervention by various colonial forces, including, and so we should learn from that in terms of the party that we have and the discipline that we have and the consciousness that we have and the fact that that revolution has to be complete and it has to destroy all of the colonizers who actively engage in maintaining our oppression, and it has to eliminate all of the neo-colonial forces who would be colonizers. And I think it's also important, Comrade Secretary General mentioned this whole thing about, he characterized something about the Catholic Church playing some kind of role. But the fact is the Catholic Church was the Christian church. It was the church. The Protestantism didn't even exist at the time that this was occurring. And so when you say the Catholic Church, you're talking about Christianity, the Christian church. Also, I think it's important to recognize that the fact that the threat that Haiti represented, it was the first successful struggle against colonialism, and it initiated the struggle against the colonial mode of production. That's where it was initiated, and we should take lessons from that, and we have to complete that revolutionary trajectory and accept the fact that Haiti was such a significant force in helping us to know our own significance and what it's going to take to win our liberation, our freedom from this social system. So death to colonialism, death to the colonizer, victory to African people, and we're talking about relentless struggle for the liberation of Africa, for the unification of Africa, and for the redemption of our Africa, Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you so much. Thank you, Secretary General Luwezi Kinshasa, for this profound discussion. And thank you to all of you, our guests, for participating in this Sunday study. Make sure you like and follow the chairman on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday study. Next week's theme, we'll be discussing what will a liberated Africa look like? So you don't want to miss it. Volunteer for the public relations team for the chairman by emailing volunteer@omaliyeshitela.org. Build the African Revolution, Coupe Tete, Boule Kai, and Vanguard Up. Uhuru.